Austin, I'd like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 19th episode of Esoteric Science Roundtable. The subject for today's show is Egypt. First of all, I'd like to thank Russell Dowden, Don Lawrence, and an anonymous student for their assistance this evening. I'd also like to thank Jesus Garza, an instructor and staff member at ACAC, for letting this mini studio class work as a crew for this live broadcast today. There's no better way to learn than to dive right in and get your feet wet with on-the-job training. These folks can put on their own live shows and broadcast from the studio. And I personally know a few people who have the knowledge and the skill to come down and put on a quality show. I encourage everyone who has something that they want to present to the public to come down and start a live show or turn in a taped show that can be broadcast. Whether you agree with my particular philosophy or not, I still encourage anyone to come down, to consider access as a viable means to get your message out to the public. It's very inexpensive to put on a show here, and it's a very valuable tool to be able to get a message out. And the more local programming that is aired, the less you'll see of the bland federal programming that's been infiltrating Access Television lately. This is a This is a live call-in show, and I will be taking your calls at about 40 past the hour to discuss today's topic. As far as the origins of Egyptian culture are concerned, they are very much shrouded in mystery. The age of this great seat of learning and civilization is still not agreed upon, largely due to the lack of writings or documents that offer actual dates for the magnificent remnants of this ancient land. The age in particular of the Sphinx and of the three great pyramids that are attributed to Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus, respectively, those are in particular dispute as to the actual dates of those when they were built. Now, all these monuments are located in what's known as Giza, a particular area that's in the north of the country of Egypt, and that is in many ways considered one of their most sacred sites. Now, we do have the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians, and we also have the writings of the Greeks, who intermingled and exchanged much between their culture and that of Egypt, as the bulk of what historians and modern academia are willing to accept as a legitimate glimpse into what took place in the complex, multifaceted culture that sprang up along the Nile and reached unparalleled achievements. Now, that is more of the way that the exoteric scientist or your mainstream academia would choose to follow and study the historical significance and history of Egypt. By trying to find the writings, trying to decipher the hieroglyphics, trying to look at the artifacts that are remaining, checking into the tombs, trying to learn more about the different habits and the different aspects of their culture. Now, as far as studying Egypt from the aspect of esoteric science, in an attempt to grasp an understanding of the inner workings within Egypt, there are three things that must be considered in trying to evaluate a historical overview of what took place back then. Now, the first of the things that has to be considered is the religion of the people. And we find in any great culture, religion is one item that does play, in many ways, the most significant part. And so that's something definitely to be looked into, is the religion of these people. Now, the symbolism of their religion can be compared to the other symbolism available both from earlier and later times. And the inner meaning can be discovered through analogy to some degree. Next, the philosophy of the Egyptians has to be taken into account. Again, actual writings are scarce, and we have to depend largely on the writings of the Greeks or some of the Hellenized Jews, such as Porphyry, also known as Malik, to get an idea of the philosophical beliefs and the climate of the times. Lastly, the science of Egypt is also something that has to be taken into consideration in forming an esoteric view of the civilizations that stretch far back into antiquity. Now, the more controversial means that esoteric science uses in order to gauge and judge what took place in the far distant past, especially times that go so far back that we don't really have any written records that have survived to this day, and again with hieroglyphics, hieroglyphics are still subject to debate as to how they should be interpreted and what they all mean. and also as to the age of when the hieroglyphics were produced. Those all are still points of contention. And so the one way in which esoteric science chooses to get past just the material aspect of the historical landscape that was going on back in those days, one way that is used is by means of a clairvoyant research. And a clairvoyant research has to be explained as a higher means of seeing than it would be considered through your average psychic, from a Miss Cleo, for instance, or something like that. The clairvoyant sense is from the mental aspect of a man, whereas the average psychic is drawing their influence from the emotional aspect of a man. Since the mental aspect of man is a higher, more spiritual aspect, drawing knowledge from that realm is a way in which more accurate and, again, more spiritual, closer to the source information can be drawn down and can be made use of. Now, again, this is a very controversial method for the most part, because not everybody can make use of this means, and so it's very difficult to validate for the average person what is discerned by these means. But this is where trusting your intuition has to come into play, and that is a very large part of esoteric science, is learning to trust your intuition, learning to listen to your own inner voice and to follow that to find direction. And so if we can trust our intuition enough, we can do some research into some of the writers that did have this high clairvoyant sense, that were able to tap into the mental levels, and that were able to bring back information in their writings that we can make use of to kind of get a more well-rounded view of what took place in antiquity back in those times, and that being for the Egyptian times or any other times for that matter. Now, this clairvoyant sense is also taps into what is known as the Akashic records, and that is a point where past, present, and probable future can be tapped into. And so we can put ourselves, by means of this process, into someone else's shoes, literally, to the extent to where we can understand the feelings, the emotions, even the weather at the particular time. Very, very detailed points can be garnished by this method, and so we can get a very well-rounded view of what took place back then. Now, again, the psychic sense, based on the emotional aspect, is more colored and tainted by our own personal viewpoint, and so that's something that has to be kept in mind too. Sometimes there's a confusion between the psychic sense and the clairvoyant sense, but true clairvoyance, once it carries through, is, again, much closer to the spiritual cause that leads to our physical plane effects, and so it can be considered a valid method by which to use to draw information down to our physical plane that we can make use of. Again, but you have to trust your intuition as to whether you yourself would deem that this is a valid science or whether it's quackery. Now, some of the writers in particular that I'd like to speak about, there are two in particular that did a fine job, in my estimation, on kind of giving a better, more well-rounded and an esoteric insight into the days of ancient Egypt. And one of those persons would be Rudolf Steiner, who is the Austrian spiritual scientist, and also Edgar Casey, who is America's sleeping prophet, who lived in Virginia. And there are others as well that have made similar claims using similar means, but these are the main two I would really want to cover today, because I personally intuitively lean towards these two particular writers. They for some reason really ring true to me, and I tend to gravitate towards these two writers. And so if I could elaborate a bit on some of their views of Old Egypt. And as far as the view of Rudolf Steiner is concerned, he talked a lot about the cultural life force as it would find its way through different cultures throughout time. And it's pretty well agreed upon by esoteric science across the board from all camps that the knowledge that sprang up in the East and that sprang up in the more of the West or the Mid-East in Egypt did originally come from the continent of Atlantis, and that this continent of Atlantis did have its heyday. It was a seat of learning and civilization during its time, and then it subsided in a series of cataclysms, 3 great cataclysms that gradually took different parts of this great continent under the water and eventually destroyed it. And so the esoteric science viewpoint is that this is where the strain of culture found its way from the West to the East. And Rudolf Steiner shows us that the culture, as far as it's descending through the various cycles of this current race that we're in, which is called the Aryan race, whereas the previous race, the Atlantean race, gave birth to our current time. And so the first subrace, so-called, of our Aryan race was the Indian, then the Persian, then the Egyptian, but the Egyptian had other facets as well attached to it, then the Greco-Roman, and then the fifth, which is our current subrace, our current age right now, which is the Anglo-Saxon dispensation. Now, during the Egyptian times, we also had the Chaldean, the Assyrian, and the Jewish, as well as the Babylonian influence during that time. So all of these different varying camps and cultures intermingled into what's generally considered to be the Egyptian culture, because that was the high seat of civilization and learning. That was a predominant seat of that particular culture at that time. And so again, we do tend to identify that time with Egypt because they were the high seat of power at that time. And so by virtue of these different cultural strains intermingling back at this time, they obviously had to have some means to communicate, and they obviously had to have some things in common, and trade developed as a result. Although trade had gone on previously to this, it began to take on more, it became more specialized because of the varying different cultures intermingling and mixing. And also the geographic location of Egypt as well, if we consider that. It was in such a place that it could receive from Asia and from the Middle East and from other parts of Africa. It was centrally located enough to where it could be the one seat for all of this flow of learning that took place. And it actually was the seat of the advanced knowledge of the times. And there were many different aspects to the religion during that time. And the general term used to describe to describe religion at that time were the mysteries. And there was a whole science devoted to the study of the mysteries and to the practice of the mysteries. This science of initiation was practiced through various schools, and some of these included the mysteries of Isis, the mysteries of Serapis, and the mysteries of Osiris. And these all are graded ranks as far as the different studies, and so they all are higher levels, one after the next. And so you would begin with the mysteries of Isis, and then find your way into the mysteries of Serapis, and then ultimately into the mysteries of Osiris. And the amount of knowledge would be gained over that period of time. Now, if you could imagine looking at how, if we could follow the different varying subraces of our current Anglo-Saxon race, of our current Aryan race rather, and see that if you have the Indian, the Persian, the Egyptian, and then at the bottom you have the fourth, which is the Greco-Roman, and then you have here the Anglo-Saxon, which is our current. If you draw a line, you find that from the Anglo-Saxon to the Egyptian, there's a parallel between the third subrace and the fifth subrace. And so we find a lot of similarities going on between what took place in Egyptian times and what is going on in our day. And the other person that I want to speak about is Edgar Casey and some of his views as to what took place during those early days. Now, he speaks much about the various the various colonies of Atlantis that spread away from Atlantis during these various cataclysms that took place. Now, he wrote much of what he did write concerning Atlantis and Egypt during the 40s. He would give what were called life readings for individuals, and he would basically fall asleep or go into a similar condition to a trance condition, and he would be asked questions, and he, in this sleep-like condition, would end up giving answers, and much knowledge came out that way. A lot of times things were given out in these life readings that were somewhat peripheral to the question being asked, but they offered much added insight that wouldn't have been gained otherwise. And so a lot of times people gleaned a little extra from these life readings than they would normally bargain for. And so a picture can be painted and put together from all of these different varying myths and what have you, and we can kind of paint it together and paint a more complete picture and see when we study and take a look at some of these colonies, for instance. And some of these colonies were the American Southwest with the cliff dwellers. We also had some of the colonies that migrated from Atlantis down to South America, and that would be the Incans. And also in Central America, we find the Mayans. And as well, we find those that have gone on to parts of Europe and Egypt. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is some of the main similarities that we find between these different varying cultures. And that would be in particular between the South Americans and the Incas and the Mayans and the Egyptians. And that is the pyramid. We find the pyramid, the four-sided pyramid, as something that's very important to all of these cultures. And we find it across the globe, many places, and there are even many places where pyramids exist that they were built so long ago that they don't really even, just the remnants are remaining currently. We even have mounds in the Midwest of the United States too that are kind of a variation on the pyramid theme. And so again, this four-sided pyramid is very crucial and very key to all of the cultures of these varying different colonies. Even though they were so far away, they still built pyramids, and that's still a bit of wonderment to people as far as why did these different varying cultures that were so far away, why is it that they were able to come up with the same concept for a pyramid? And that, again, is something that people still to this day have not... something that people to this day have still not exactly been able to fully understand. They can't put the two together, or the three together in this instance. Now, Casey talks about some of the ability and capacity that the ancient Atlanteans had, and that they in turn passed on through their furthered out colonies into the Egyptian days. And they made use of what was called the night side energy. And basically this is tantamount to tapping into the energy of the earth in the same sense that Tesla would, or in the same sense of a Wilhelm Reich, an Orgon energy, that we have the capacity to tap into the earth itself and to use the energy that is from the very earth itself and manipulate that energy to direct it. And so machines were devised in order to use this machinery. And again, we did get this initially in the Atlantean days, and it passed over. And they had quite advanced machinery in different varying aspects for transportation and all kinds of different social areas. But one item that they did have in particular was supposedly an airship that was called the Phalanx, and that's the Atlantean term for it. And then supposedly the ancient Indian culture also made use of this very same technology in these airships, and they were called by that society the Virmana. And so there are many legends of these flying cigar-shaped airships that were used back in that day. Again, that's all certainly subject to much speculation because we don't really have one lying around that we can show as an example. There's not one in a museum somewhere that we can say, hey, look, this was the airship that was used some 10,000 years ago or longer. And so they did establish also laws and a spiritual tradition. And tying that all into the idea of the pyramids, excuse me, again, it's very crucial. The pyramids that we've come to know through history, if you ever watch the Discovery Channel, they portray the Great Pyramid and the two adjacent pyramids as great monuments, as tombs to the pharaoh kings. And so they claim, again, that these were resurrected in honor of these great kings. The problem is that there's never been a body found in any of the pyramids. The kings and the pharaohs were buried over 100 miles away in the Valley of the Kings. And that's where we find the Tomb of Tutankhamen, in which many people are familiar with, King Tut. And many of the great kings and pharaoh god rulers of the time, they were buried much further away. They were not buried at Giza. They were not buried inside of the Great Pyramids. And so how to explain the sarcophagi that exist inside of these Great Pyramids? What is the purpose for having a tomb-like situation inside of these Great Pyramids? And that brings us all the way back to the idea of the mysteries. The mysteries that were enacted, that were part of the religion, science, and philosophy. And again, when you think about the idea of esoteric science, those three are intertwined. They're inextricably intertwined. You cannot separate one from the other. So this system of religion, philosophy, and science, as the Egyptians used it through the so-called mysteries, enabled a candidate to work through varying methods, through study, and through practice of way of life to improve oneself. And we see this mirrored in all of the great cultures throughout time, that there's always been a certain segment of any culture that has either set themselves apart from the mainstream or taken some what would normally be considered extreme measures to divert one's attention away from our lower material life and to bring ourselves into alignment with the higher aspect of ourselves. And this practice has been demonstrated throughout all of the great cultures throughout time. And basically, to describe it in a nutshell, the candidate for initiation would lie down in the sarcophagi, and they would be zapped, if you will, with a rod, and this rod would in turn generate that so-called night side energy that I spoke about, energy generated from the earth itself, would somewhat zap this person, if you will, and cause them to be released from their physical body. And so the more all-knowing aspect of the person, the soul, if you will, took a little trip and took the proverbial trip through the underworld. And we oftentimes hear of spending 3 days or 3.5 days in the tomb. We hear that theme recurring through many of the great myths and religions. And that whole idea, that whole concept of being in the tomb 3.5 days correlates to this concept of being an initiate, a candidate for the mysteries. In the instance where one lies in the sarcophagus, they are physically, by means of a device, forced to remove their consciousness from their dense physical vehicle, and then they are challenged, if you will. They're guided and taken through an underworld situation, and they're forced to deal with these lower aspects of themselves and to overcome them, hopefully. In some instances, though, the candidate for initiation was not able to make it back with all of his faculties intact. Insanity may have set in, or in some cases, death as well. The candidate was not strong enough to make it through this experience, and so they didn't make it back. But in many instances, the person did make it through this test, this trial, this initiation, and they came back as a stronger person, and they were able to take into themselves added capacities, if you will, as a result of this trial, this test. Now, according to Edgar Casey, it took 100 years to construct the Great Pyramid, and Hermes, as he's known by the Greeks, or Thoth, as he's known properly by the Egyptians, was the leader, if you will, of the people of the time. He was the god priest, if you will, that watched over the people, and he is also considered the light bringer. He's supposedly brought light, and he is supposedly also, in mythology, the originator of the esoteric sciences of wisdom in general, as far as terrestrial wisdom, as far as man's search for wisdom. He is considered the father, and that would be Hermes or Thoth. Hermes in the Greek, Thoth is the Egyptian terminology. And according to Casey, between 10,490 BC and 10,390 BC, the building of the Great Pyramid was overseen. And again, just to reiterate, the Great Pyramids are definitely not burial chambers. Again, no body has ever been found, no corpse, no mummy has ever been found in any of these Great Pyramids. And if anyone is willing to do the research, they would be able to prove that to themselves. and if you were to try to contact Zahi Hawass, the antiquities director at Giza, I'm sure he would have to concede that as well, that there were never any bodies or mummies or corpses found inside of the Great Pyramids. And the sarcophagi in there, again, are part of this trial, this test, this initiation process that I talked about. Casey also talked about great records from the Atlantean days that were preserved and that were kept in a hall of records, so to speak, underneath the Great Sphinx, relatively speaking. And he has claimed that they would be found in our day, and actually it has passed the time that he did predict, keeping in mind, though, that trying to predict the future, there's always probabilities as far as the future, but no one can really, it's quite difficult to peg down the future for certain. He also did make a conditional statement that it would depend on man's consciousness as well. So if we were not ready, so to speak, for that knowledge to be given back to mankind, then perhaps it would have to be held off a bit longer until we could earn the right to embrace that technology and the knowledge of this long ago time and to make use of it in our current day. Now, there are also some contemporary researchers that have also made certain allegations about the Great Pyramids, and two of those folks would be Graham Hancock and Robert Buvall. These gentlemen allege that since, in one instance, since there are watermarks at a certain level on the Great Pyramids, they're made of limestone, and so the water has made a mark that to many people coincides with the time of the Great Flood, and so they feel that the Great Flood that is documented in all of the great world's religions was also the same flood that left the marks on the pyramids. And so they also allege that the three main pyramids, the Great Pyramid and the two adjacent pyramids, if you look up into space, or if you would have looked up into space 10,500 years ago, that you would see the mirror of the three stars that make up the belt of Orion, that supposedly that they lined up, if you will, with the three pyramids. And so that is how they try to assign the date of 10,500 years ago to the building of the pyramids. Now, I would make one comment that if indeed the so-called Ice Age or the Great Flood did take place around 10,500 years ago, then it probably wouldn't have been able to leave the marks on the pyramids, because if they weren't constructed until that time, then it wouldn't make sense that these marks would be left from the same Great Flood that led to the creation of these monuments. And so I tend to feel that possibly these watermarks are from a later ice age, maybe from around 5,000 years ago or thereabouts. And let's see, there's also the idea of the pyramids that are on Mars. And there's a gentleman named Richard C. Hoagland that has brought that information out quite a bit. And even the name Cairo, the name of the Egyptian city Cairo, means Mars. Now, I'm not alleging that we came from Mars, which to a certain degree Richard Hoagland kind of does buy into that theory somewhat. I don't personally believe that's the case, but I certainly do believe that life that existed on that planet and ours did coincide to some degree, because the possibility of having pyramids on that planet as well as our planet, that's just way too coincidental, as well as the Sphinx-like artifacts that we find on Mars, as well as the Sphinx that we find here. And there supposedly are other pyramids and another Sphinx that have just been located off the coast of Cuba. And there hasn't been a whole lot of information that's come out about that as of late. There's been a little bit here and there, and we're still, I think, going to be finding more out about that. But allegedly, there is a city that has been found about a mile thereabouts off of the coast of Cuba that some researchers have been able to track and get some cameras down there, and allegedly they've seen pyramids and they've seen a Sphinx down there. And so that could be some remnants of Atlantis, possibly. You know, we don't know that for sure, but that's always a possibility. Now, again, when we find that the pyramids are in so many different places, possibly underneath the ocean in certain places, definitely above land in several places that are thousands of miles apart geographically. And if we want to take into consideration that there are likely the pyramids on Mars and very well on other planets that there may have been constructed on as well. So if we take that all into consideration, there's a bit too much of a coincidence for all of that in my estimation. And if we are familiar with the tradition of the mystery schools throughout antiquity and how that plays in, then we can definitely see that there is a coincidence likely that took place where the religion of the ancients, which was a monotheistic religion contrary to some belief. Some people believe that the ancients worshiped the sun, but all of the ancients that worshiped the sun as a symbol of the one God, and that's ever been the case. And once you understand the symbolism, you can discover more about that. Later in Egyptian symbolism, you find much animal symbolism, and they also start to get into the process of mummification much more, and a lot of attention is paid to the idea of reincarnation. Now, since the Egyptians did love Egypt, they wanted to be reincarnated back into that land, and so they tried to do what steps they thought were necessary in order to ensure that they would indeed be reincarnated back in that time. And as far as the animal symbolism, they didn't worship the animals per se, but they liked the qualities, they admired the qualities of certain animals, and so they kept these animals close to them so that they could get the vibe, so to speak, emanating from these animals. Whatever particular qualities they appreciated in these different animals, they'd want to keep these animals close to them so that they could draw from their influence. And again, with the idea of mummification, trying to ensure that you are reincarnated back into the area that you were born into. And many times the pets would be mummified along with their owners. And I don't know that it was necessarily the natural time for those particular pets to go. They might have gone against their will, but at any rate, in many instances you see that they're added into the tombs with some of their owners. Now, the mystery tradition that's been passed down has found its way into the different varying cultures that came after the Egyptian. In particular, the Jewish culture, because as many people are aware, they were held captive in Egypt, and this is where Moses was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. And there's much talk in esoteric science that Jesus spent some time learning in Egypt as well, which tends to make sense because proximity-wise he was very close. And there's always the discussion of the missing years between age 12 and age 30. That's there's not much accounting for in any of the Gospels or any of the records that we have during that time that relate to that particular incident. And so there is much allegation that Jesus as well was initiated into some of the mysteries in Egypt. And certainly the Greeks borrowed their system of initiation from the Egyptians. There was much interaction between those societies back then, and the Greeks definitely did pull much of their influence from Egyptian society, and it very much permeated much of their writings, their philosophy, their religion, very much so. They borrowed very much. Now again, keeping in mind the idea that Egypt was this ancient seat of civilization and the ancient seat of high learning back then. It was a very cosmopolitan area, and it was a virtual melting pot of philosophers, scholars, sages, and wise men. One of the main reasons for that was the Alexandrian Library. And the Alexandrian Library was a great, great library that held many, many papyrus rolls, allegedly hundreds of thousands of papyrus rolls, and different texts from these varying cultures that found their way into this one depository, if you will. And this is another main reason for this to become a high center of learning for the ancient world. And allegedly, the Alexandrian Library was built around 332 BC, but it probably was built far before that in all actuality. It was first destroyed in the 1st century BC by fire accidentally, and that was during the time of Cleopatra. The second time you find the Alexandrian Library destroyed was by Aurelian in 273 AD, and the third time you find the Alexandrian Library destroyed was by the Christians under Theodosius in 389 AD, and that's probably the most well-known rendering and renting of the temple that held all that great knowledge. The final remnants were wiped out by Amru the Saracen in 640 A.D. So you can see that's quite a long period in our history that this library was in existence in its varying incarnations. And you could see how it took several attempts to finally bring that down and to eradicate the remnants of that knowledge from those days, as it was held in the papyruses in these different rolls and kept in this form and fashion. Now, there is also much speculation, allegation, and some record that certain of the papyrus rolls and certain of the records were saved, salvaged, and were placed and hidden in other places. And some of these may have been discovered, and there are others that are yet to be discovered, and so time will probably tell as far as that goes. Now, as soon as the Alexandrian Library was destroyed, we have a period of time that comes in that we call the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were the time that came in and that we're familiar with more from history in Europe, more so than Egyptian history. But as the seat of civilization declined in Egypt and moved on, again, through the varying sub-races of our Aryan race, the Dark Ages set in, and esoteric science had to go underground, as it has many times in the past. And you have your varying cycles of light and dark to where esoteric science is going to be prevalent and is going to be revered and it's going to be respected and it's going to get the just praise that it deserves. And there are other times, too, equal times, when it has to go underground because it's not being well received at the time due to religious persecution or scientific persecution or different aspects that bring it in non-favor for any given cycle of time. And so it goes in and out according to how it's viewed publicly and usually how the rulers, how the opinions that the rulers have of it at any given time. Now, another thing that's important to keep in mind is Christianity coming in at that time. Christianity came in at that time and became more prevalent at the time as well. And that's also part of the destroying of the Alexandrian Library. The old mystery ways had to fall by the wayside so that Christianity could come into vogue and so that the Christian mysteries could be the prevalent mysteries. And so we find it demonstrated in the Gospels, the 5 stages of scientific process of initiation from a Christian standpoint, and that is birth, baptism, transfiguration, death, and resurrection. And those 5 stages, as are demonstrated for us in the gospel narratives, show us our current rendition, our current established method of initiation, and how it's, again, the mystery tradition has traveled through all the varying cultures throughout time, from the Atlantean days all the way to our current age, and that's the main dispensation now that has kept the mysteries intact within it, that is viable for all men today, is the Christian religion. And as St. Paul says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now, another institution that has been a custodian, in particular of the Egyptian symbolism, is Masonry. Masonry is steeped in Egyptian symbolism, and they are the custodians of the ancient rites that were carried on during those times. And Masonry will have its heyday in the future, and we will restore the symbolism, and it will see the light of day once again as the mysteries are once again brought into everyday light, and they're more acknowledged by the mainstream as far as the people out there, the public at large. They're going to be more aware of this process of initiation, the science of initiation, and so they're going to make use of that. Again, this is all depending on man's willingness and understanding of this symbolism and of this technology, and how well we're going to be able to adapt it to our lives. It all is depending on man, and we have free will in this instance to determine how this is going to flow, as to how soon we're going to bring in this knowledge, to bring in this gnosis back into functioning activity once again, and to get past this old age that we're passing out of, which is a Piscean age of devotion, and move full-fledged, full force into this all-inclusive age of the Aquarian age that we're slowly transitioning into now, if we can make use of that. Looks like I do have a few calls on the line, so I'd like to check with the folks out there and see what they have to say this evening. Hello, caller.
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, yourself?
Yes. I called you a while back about your show on Atlantis.
Yes.
And I was telling you about the tablets that they found in Peru called
Okay, you know what?
Tablets of Thoth, the Atlanteans.
Yes, you
and
did.
You criticized me and said
No,
it was
incorrect. I did not.
mythology.
No, I
and
did
now
not.
You're talking about it on your show.
I did not criticize you. I don't believe in my estimation because I did watch the show back on more than one occasion. My producer has since picked up that book, and I did read some of that book, and I feel that what I discussed on my initial show did fall hand in hand to a large degree with what was in that book. So I don't see the point of contention. I see that we're more in line with our view on this than not.
Oh, yeah, I really agree with you, and I think you're a very intelligent person. And I've been in the New Age movement for quite some time, and I agree fully with what you're talking about. Another thing that you can really study about the mystery schools in Horus in ancient Egypt
Yes.
was it was all based on the flower of life. And that was a key in their mystery schools, or esoteric science, as you would call it, in ancient Egypt. And that's another really cool thing to study as well, because it'll explain a lot more about the religion. But, hey, I appreciate you picking up that book and enlightening yourself to that. It's
Right. Well, if anybody mentions something on the air, I usually try to check it out because who knows, how I'm going to get more additional information. And I also like people to be able to check me and keep me on the straight and narrow. If I may be giving some misinformation or a slant that's a little too confined, I like people to be able to call and flesh it out and round it out a bit and give it a wider context. So I do thank you for watching and thank you for your comments.
Yes, no problem. Thank you.
Take care. Hello, caller.
Yeah, I had a question about, you were talking about the possibility of human life having come from Mars.
No, actually, I said that
something to that effect, right?
Richard C. Hoagland actually is a scientist that he's popularized the face on Mars, and he is more of a proponent that human life, that we are Martians, that we're the new latest version of the Martians transported to Earth and setting up culture here. I myself don't necessarily agree with that point of view.
Okay, well, I'm more curious about your opinion on, the possibility of, I don't know much about ancient Egypt or Egyptian gods, but the possibility of that having some significance in the myth of, the fallen angels and stuff like that, like the presence of demons, too,
Well, traditionally, according to esoteric science, the legend of the fall took place way, way far back in antiquity as compared to the Egyptian times.
Oh, yeah.
And I did speak about this actually last week. I had a show called The Origin of Evil, in which I spoke about, according to esoteric science, man achieved his self-consciousness or individualization around 18 million years ago. And so that would be coinciding with the legend of the fall or the Luciferic influence that we achieved at that time.
So what is that according to, though? I'm just curious.
Well, basically,
how's that been determined?
By a couple of methods. The main one would be by translating old religious records, and primarily the old Indian religious records. If you study the stanzas of Daizan, and there are a lot of books that have been written about it. And then the second method is, which is a more controversial one, which is the clairvoyant research. And there are a few writers throughout antiquity, in recent times actually.
They said someone came to them and said that.
No, actually, they were able to lift their consciousness to a certain state to where there's supposedly man, according to esoteric science, is a multifaceted being. We're physical, we're emotional, we're mental, and you can tap into those succeeding planes, if you will. And if you can tap into the mental plane, then you have achieved more than your average psychic can. The average psychic deals with the emotional plane. The clairvoyant deals with the mental.
The chakra system, in my opinion, and the eightfold model of human consciousness. Don't you think?
That all ties in. You could say eightfold, or sevenfold, ninefold, threefold. Different dispensations have their different, but it all boils down to the same thing, really. You can all tie that down to the same basic concept.
But one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
Like I said, I don't know much about Egyptian gods, but I'm real curious about the myth of the fall. Like I said, and what do you think about that? Like the presence of demons. I also read something recently. I'm not much for the Bible. I haven't read that real well, but something about Christ casting the bodies of those fallen angels into swine.
Oh, into swine, right. Well, those weren't fallen angels per se. Those were more, like you say, demons. And they're always going to be, if you trust esoteric science and if you even can go into quantum physics a bit, that there are different varying planes and that there are different vibratory rates And so that just because our physical eye can see certain things, there are also certain things that we can't perceive physically.
What is that vibratory rates? I don't know. I've read about that, and I don't quite.
Well, imagine, okay, if you look at a piece of wood, those atoms are vibrating at a certain rate to create wood, or flesh, or steel, or
They're
air.
vibrating as in, like, the internal movement?
Right, exactly. And so rate of vibration is going to determine density. And
Okay.
so faster things vibrate, the less dense they are. And so that being the case, since things that are not very dense and that are very quick of vibration, if we can't perceive them, but they still may exist, you know,
Right.
and that's an example you can use is the wind, for instance. You can't see the wind, but it blows. And there are X-rays, there are ultraviolet rays, and that science can measure, but we can't perceive with our human eyesight. Same point that
you're
I'm trying to
saying
make is that there are levels of creatures out there that we can't perceive necessarily that may be acting and interacting, but we can't necessarily perceive them. But I would say that we are becoming more spiritualized, and people are seeing these kind of entities more and more so these days.
Yeah. Are you suggesting that those things that are, I think you said lower vibratory rates that we can't necessarily pick up consciously all the time, are you suggesting that those are registered in the mind's eye or on a visual level? Like, because I'm also curious about things such as, like, apparitions.
Well, again, that would
that's
be...
something that appears through the, like the
There's a physical substance tied to
unconscious.
that. There's a physical substance tied to if an apparition or a ghost or poltergeist activity, there's physical force that's tied into that activity. So it does have density, it does have mass, it does have substance, and it does have consciousness to a certain degree. But it's more like...
It's like a creature could take that form too.
In some instances,
Perhaps.
yes. In some instances, yes. But it's like a tape loop, really. A ghost is like a tape loop, if you can follow that analogy. It's just like something that recurs over and over again. It's like a pattern.
Well, oh yeah.
In many
yeah,
instances.
but some instances aren't.
Poltergeist activity would not be, but that is many instances been generated back to or proven to be generated from individuals living in the house. If there's a turmoil between a married couple, you might find some poltergeist activity flaring up as a result of something that they're generating themselves, not necessarily from an outside entity that's factoring in and influencing them. So that's one thing as well.
All right. Cool.
Well, have a nice evening. Do you have another quick comment? I need to let you go pretty soon. Here,
No, not really. Thanks,
okay,
sir.
thanks. Take care. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, later.
Hello?
Hey,
Caller?
how's it going today, man?
Good, yourself?
Thanks for the blowjob last night.
Thanks. Not a problem, not a problem. Oh, come on now. All right, let's try another one. Hello, caller?
Hey, what's up? How you doing?
Good, yourself?
Unfortunately, I actually got a chance to miss probably like about 30 minutes, but I just love this type of shit. Not to really cuss over there, I'm sorry.
Please don't, if you don't mind.
Just wanted to ask you real quick about Maurice Cottrell. Are you familiar with him?
Who's this?
A guy named Maurice Cottrell.
No, I can't say that I am.
Cottrell, perhaps. Anyway, he basically was on Art Bell Saturday night, and he actually has a couple of books about the Stargate, just showing the patterns, and basically, I guess they're saying he's one of the people who broke the Maya Codex.
Oh, really?
Anyway, I just want to ask your opinions on the Stargate and anything else you may have covered.
A Stargate in the sense that it's a transportation device from one plane to another or one place to another?
Exactly. If there's anything else you can cover on that. What else did I want you to cover real quick? Have you heard anything word about Antarctica?
Well, supposedly there were ancient civilizations in Antarctica as well, and if you're familiar with Hitler and what he tried to do, he was very much involved with the occult, and he wanted to find these entities that lived up north in Antarctica, to get their help so that he could whip up on us a little bit better. And so there's a lot of myth, if you will, that talks about these ancient races that live underneath the earth, that live underneath Atlantis, and that are remnants from earlier civilizations or maybe otherworldly people that came here from other planets, what have you. It's hard to say. There's all kind of there are all kind of myths like that, but I do believe all myth is based in fact to some degree. So you're gonna find some grain of truth in these kinds of stories. It's just how much truth is there and how much of it is just not truth.
Also, do you know anything about the Hall of Records? Have they actually found that yet?
That's a good question. Florida State University actually was doing some research down there, and they had supposedly found a chamber that was below the Sphinx But as to what's been extracted from that or not, see, there very well may have been some taking out of some information that was just kind of hush-hush, hey, don't tell anybody kind of situation. That's always possible, you never know, because the powers that be try to keep a clamp on this kind of information coming out for the most part. So if it was discovered already, that's possible, or we may be yet to see the day come, because according to Casey anyway, we have to be ready for that information. So if we're not ready for it, it may not be time for us to grasp that just yet. Looks like I lost that call. Let me try somebody else. Hello, caller.
Yeah, do you think this is why a lot of people are gay?
No idea. Thanks. Have a nice evening. Hello, caller.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually do know a little bit about the chamber that they found under the Sphinx's arm. The Egyptian government won't allow them to dig there at all.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
And does that have something to do with Zahi Hawass and the antiquities there at Giza? He's the antiquities director there, as far as I know.
Yeah, all I do know is that
Hello, caller.
digging any. Hello.
Go ahead. Sorry, cut you off.
No problem. They put a lot of restrictions on going into digging under that. I think it's the left paw of the Sphinx.
I think that's correct. Yes.
And they won't allow anyone to dig there. There's all kinds of court battles going on, in
Have you heard that there is a city that's been discovered about a mile below the coast of Cuba, and that they've supposedly, allegedly found pyramids and a Sphinx down there?
Now, I hadn't heard of that.
And I just heard it. I did hear it on the Art Bell radio show a few weeks back, and there was a follow-up on it. And I actually did hear the researchers that allegedly had sent the cameras down and had the pictures brought back and to verify that all this was indeed the case. But a lot. There hasn't been a lot about that as well. Supposedly there was a little bit of a blurb here and there in some of the major media outlets, but I didn't really catch it myself.
Yeah.
And so that one is another one that you're going to have to maybe put on the shelf and wait on and see how that one pans out too.
There's a lot of things like that. Like a lot of people are actually NASA is trying to disprove the pyramid thing on Mars. Have you seen that? The face and the.
Well, I think they are going to send somebody to Cydonia. This next mission is supposed to go to Cydonia to take a look at it.
Yeah, the picture that NASA re-released that showed that it supposedly was an anomaly, a light anomaly.
Right.
Was the only that was the only photograph that was actually altered.
That was rough.
Enhanced it.
Yes, I know. Well, you know what a NASA enhancement equates to.
Yeah.
And also another thing with that Mars Observer, I believe it was, the camera that was on that mission was owned by an individual. All the rights to the pictures were owned by a guy. I think his name was Malin, if I'm not mistaken, and he was the sole, exclusive channel for release of that information. Somehow or another, private individual gained the rights to what was going to be released and not released on that specific mission. And so to me, that is just beyond comprehension, really.
Yeah, I mean, why are we going to such? I say we, the government of the world. Why are they going to such great lengths to hinder, what could possibly be, a great breakthrough in who we are?
I would say it's pure selfishness. I would say ultimately it's because they want to maintain this particular paradigm, this particular power structure, keep it intact, and for us to become more enlightened and more aware of how powerful we truly are as humans and what capacities we truly have innate inside of us that we can unleash and flower forth, that if everybody was practicing that and trying to bring forth their best qualities collectively, we could overtake this current paradigm that that many people are not fond of, as far as like political systems, the economic system, and the structuring that's going on right now. We could restructure things and make it a more equitable, where everybody has more of a fair shake and more of a role in the policy making, what have you, on a worldwide basis.
There was an interview that I've tried to find again. I saw it on PBS when I lived in L.A. And it was by a General Taylor, Brigadier General Taylor. This gentleman claimed, and mind you, I mean, you don't get to be a brigadier general by being stupid.
True.
He claimed that when he originally had talks with three individual species that have visited this planet before, that the original reason why they kept this a secret is because of the era that they found out that these other species existed, and the climate of the world at that time. In the 40s, we were just getting out of the Depression. Things
and
were
World
really
War
bad.
II as well.
If what he had claimed is that the thought was that if people knew how far ahead other species were of us, that it would cause us to go into such a downward spiral that we could not get back out of it.
Right.
And he said that he stands by his decision to keep it secret at that time.
Right.
But,
caller, I have to let you go because I have other calls, but thank you for your time. I do appreciate that.
Peace.
Okay, take care. Thanks. We'll try to grab one more quick call. Hello, caller? Hello, caller?
Yeah.
Caller, go ahead.
You hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Very, very briefly.
All right. What is the main topic of this? I missed the first beginning of the show.
We're talking about Egypt in general.
All right,
Ancient
then.
Egypt. Did you have a question?
Is those taxpayers paying for this?
You pay about 40 cents out of your cable bill for Access Television to do what they do down here, myself and the other people that broadcast from down here. Thanks for your time. If you have a particular opinion you'd like to espouse, do like these fellows that are doing right now are doing, take classes and learn how to put on your own show, and then you can espouse your own opinion to the public. Thanks. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
I got proof you're a child molester. Thank you.
All right. Have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you for your calls. It has been a pleasure putting on this show, and I do want to, again, commend the guys that have come down here to help out. I'd like to thank Russell Dowd and Don Lawrence and an anonymous student that are taking the classes down here in the media studio to be able to be qualified to put on their own shows, whether that's a live show or whether they're going to just be putting on some tape programming in the future. I encourage everybody to come down to Access, take advantage of this great, great platform that we have down here. It's relatively free. It's next to free. And you can espouse your viewpoints on whatever. You can talk about the kind of things that I tend to talk about. Anything. You can talk about anything. The sky's the limit. And if you're into more of an adult theme, then late at night you can do your show then. If it's more family-oriented, then, during the daytime, obviously you'll have a good opportunity to broadcast it then. And it's a great system down here. To me, there's a genuine sense of community down here at Access. From the different people that you come in contact with that are both the employees here and the different people that are putting on their own shows. There's a lot of positive energy down here. There's a lot of exchange down here. And I really commend everybody that's taken the time to come down here to take advantage of this. Again, the more local programming, and that was the origin, that's the idea behind Access, is to have local programming here for our area, for our community, that are dealing with issues that we're concerned with here in our area. And so that if we have more local programming, we'll have less of this federal programming, less of this bland federal programming, and less of this infiltration, this leech that's plaguing Access and infiltrating its way in. That's just not a good deal. And again, so I encourage more people. Let's get Access back to a local level and have some local access. I'd like to encourage everybody to stay tuned for Chris Athanas and the Reality Expander television show coming up next. I'd like to thank my producer, Chris, for commanding the helm of the Starship Esoterica, even though he kind of got to cool his heels a little bit today and just kind of point the finger. Thank you guys for putting on the show. And you guys have done a great job helping me out today. Very thankful, and I hope to see your projects in the future that you guys are going to be putting on. Thanks a lot, Austin. Catch us again next Tuesday live at 8 o'clock on Channel 10. Thanks.